listening to the Christian Ghetto Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Christian Ghetto Podcast. It is my distinct pleasure to have on today Charles Haywood. So welcome, Charles.
I am pleased to be here.
Well, it's a play. One of the reasons why I'm on doing this began with me pestering you, offline back in the days when I think I listened to you on an interview you did with Michael Anton, like way in the way back days. And then
three full years ago, probably
something like that. Yeah. And I just started pestering you online. And you said, the stuff you're writing and sending me is actually half decent. Maybe you should write and start a blog. And I thought, that's actually not a bad idea. And then one thing.
I don't think I said half. I don't think I said half decent, but yes, that wasn't. Like that.
I think the word was pretty
I
good.
encourage that.
Yeah. But anyway, so here we are. And, you and I largely agree on pretty much everything. And especially in terms of, nothing meaningful is going to happen until the left is really destroyed. And so that's a really big area of agreement that, you can build around. But we've always had our differences over this whole question, the wizard and the prophet, the techno-optimist versus the techno-pessimist. And it kind of cropped up recently. I threw out a tweet and I'll post this in the show notes, where I said, I know the winning feels good, but just remember that what is happening and try to keep a level head. And this is sort of to go back to an analysis with using Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, right? So to argue that, the American state and the American mode of governance is still largely unchanged. And so I said the channel is changing on the narrative, but in a sense, it's still the narrative and you're still being propagandized, even if it's Trump's team doing the propaganda. So in a sense, you're still dealing with the American governmental system. Even though Trump's in charge, you're watching a different program now, but most everything is still the same. And you sort of said, you came back and just said, hey, maybe we should talk about that, but I don't think that's the right way to frame it. And so being a curious sort of said, hey, let's get together and talk about that. So what was it about that framing that you found maybe didn't quite capture things?
Yeah, it's a tangled question. It really relates to all sorts of threads. You obviously have written extensively on this, particularly, or an aspect of this, particularly through the thought of Jacques Ellul, which you have read and I have not. And though on the other hand, the reading your summaries of him is almost as good as reading the book. So I mean, and obviously you focused, I think, a lot on this and its intersection as well with the managerial state and, as you mentioned, propaganda and the political illusion with Ellul. And there's a whole bunch of different threads in here. But in my kind of mind, and you can correct me if you think this is wrong, the general claim that Ellul and you are making is that we live in a very particular kind of modern state and society organization that has many defects in it. And no matter how it appears at this moment that the populist or the right wing may be gaining influence or power, that doesn't change the underlying nature of the societal organization and or governmental organization. I mean, is that more or less the claim?
Yeah, and I think the thing is, in a sense, is that maybe even larger this, and I touched on this in other threads, is the idea that, we live in a mass society and there's no real getting away from that. And we live in a technological society. And one of the things that Ellul notes is that when you're living in a technological society, you have really no option in this mass technological society, but to govern in a sense using propaganda. And so there is a sense that until a few weeks ago, the narrative officially was largely controlled by the left. And with Trump's ascension, and Trump is an interesting figure because of his media savvy. Like, he does things intuitively that a lot of people, spend a lot of time and trouble, learning how to do. And he seems to naturally just grasp how to manipulate messaging and the media instinctively. And so there's a sense where just because Trump is in office, you haven't stopped being propagandized. It's just now Trump is in control of the levers. I think there's a lot of folks that think that, okay, now that the left's been turfed, propaganda is ceasing. We're going to get our minds back. The government's going to shrink. We're going to be able to go back to grilling and living life as a good life. Everything is fine now. And the Ellul's analysis says that really no, because of the basic conditions of society, Trump has no option but to govern using propaganda. And you can see it in some of the ways that he manages things. Like I think the whole tariff thing with Canada and with Mexico was a perfect example that he's using messaging and propaganda to build justification for further action, which is one of the things that Ellul talks about in The Political Illusion, that all political acts have to have within them their understanding of how they manipulate the narrative. And so in a sense, Trump early on in the presidency is looking for early wins, and he's looking for early wins specifically around the idea that tariffs work, tariffs get results. And so he's able to shut up members of his own party who are who are critical of the idea of tariffs. And he's able to say to them now and build the messaging for the public that, look, we threatened them with tariffs. We got the results we wanted. See, tariffs work. And so now he can use that to build.
It seems to me this
Go ahead.
It seems to me this conflates different meanings, colloquial meanings of the term propaganda. And I understand that Ellul has a technical definition of it, but the idea that people attempt to build support for their political ideals through messaging and a eye to what their current actions promise their constituents in the future. If you go back to any prehistorical time, people did exactly the same thing. Obviously, technology allows that to be broadcast over a longer distance to a greater number of people, which is the nature of the modern state. I mean, that's one of the points you made as well. But that's really kind of a separate topic. At its heart, the idea that people have to be persuaded through various mechanisms in order to support a political leader's goals, it is neither original nor bad. The conflation, it seems to me, comes in is because the left has historically used propaganda in the sense of attempting to convince people that, in Orwell's terms, truth is lies and lies are truth, that is, to distort reality. And the idea that it's simply not, it's a difference of quality, not of degree, to say trans men are men, and to say, I'm going to focus now on the things I'm doing on Canada so that I can build support for my later activities vis-a-vis Canada. Those things simply aren't the same thing. I mean, they are as kind of some kind of extremely high level, but only at a level of generality that's so general as to be useless.
Yeah. See, whereas I think if you look at Ellul in propaganda, I think he talks about the phenomenon of what happened with the left. And so Ellul's basic phenomenon is that in order to generate a mass society, you have to undermine all the normal means of social control, and that, sort of building society up through small communities. So once you obtain that social control through the use of propaganda, which becomes necessary once you've kind of swept away the bulk of small communities and normal social relations. And what Ellul argues is that the primary purpose of propaganda is to keep the technological society, the mass society, kind of running. And so he argues that in its best form, propaganda really is non-ideological. So the propagandist uses whatever tools that are at hand to keep the technological system, the technological society going. And the mistake that, and he details this very specifically, that the mistake that the left made is they made their messaging ideological. And in a sense, then it becomes bad propaganda because they lost sight of the purpose for which propaganda exists. And in many ways, I might argue that what Trump and Musk are doing, in a sense of the kind of make America great, cleansing the system, getting rid of all this excess, is that they're in some ways going back to the heart and core of what propaganda is really all about, in the sense of, let's get back to the basics. Let's make, human technical progress great again. Let's, strip away all this extra fluff, all this lies and falsehoods and everything. And we can get back to just making good products, making money and going to the moon. So in some ways, I would make the argument that perhaps Trump is a better propagandist than the liberal regime that he's replacing, in part because Trump is better aligned with the essential nature of American society and the technological society, if that makes sense.
It's no doubt true that we live in a mass society, and obviously intermediary institutions have largely disappeared. And so, this has been a commonplace since Robert Nisbet wrote about it in the 40s, and people were touching on these things, though not in quite as explicit terms beforehand. But to say that, maybe we're talking about different things, but when we say propaganda is necessary to keep a mass society going, what does that mean? Like, going how? And in the sense of like propaganda, if propaganda in this term is merely a synonym for political leaders spreading a coherent message based upon demonstrable facts, that's not what most people think of when they say propaganda. There's really two questions in there, but like, what is keeping going a mass society mean in this context? And why is the term propaganda even remotely appropriate for that if it's, as I characterized it, its usage that, the Musk-Trump usage?
Okay, so that would be a really good question. It's in the sense of all of the underlying fundamentals of sort of the expectations that people have for what they should be doing in life and so forth. So the sense of, when advertisements, put out certain images of what life should be, you're creating an image in people's minds of this is what's aspirational. The example I used was in my most recent piece was the home from Home Alone 2 and the home from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? So there's this sense of this is presented as a perfectly normal family home. And you think to yourself, well, what's wrong with that? Well, the idea is that contained in that message, and you see this, in many different ways across the media ecosystem, is that a sense, well, this is aspirational. But everybody knows that, like, maybe the top 5, top 3, top 2% of income earners, wealth holders are really able to live in a home like that. And then, so what about the rest of the people? Well, they're still expected to be aspiring to that home. So they're expected to go to college. They're expected to get a certain type of job. They're expected to live a certain life, buy a certain number of things. And so across the thing, you have this sense of, and then what happens when the system doesn't produce the same kind of spiritual satisfactions that it used to. So the idea is that propaganda is there to create the meaning, a sense of what you're doing is an inherent good. So getting up, working 40 hours a week, continuing to innovate on technology and so forth and so forth. And Ellul has drawn that in contrast to the kind of life
what if those things are an inherent good? What if those things are an inherent good? What we're saying is that you don't like the messaging that Musk puts out because it's too much about Mars and not enough about your local church, which I have a lot of sympathy for. But it's not obvious that one of those things, on an objective basis, objective meaning if a guy from Mars came down, that one of those things is preferable to the other. We describe one as propaganda for the mass society and the other as, based non-propaganda for the aware. But really, they're the same thing.
Yeah. And see, this is, I guess, the thing is where Ellul then looks at, so what are the downstream side, like the costs to engaging in mass society. And one of the costs that he looks at is the effects on the psyche, in a sense of that it creates people who are generally more anxious, more depressed, and so forth. And you can see some of these things as we get out of World War II and really into the heart of the full flowering of the technological society, the increase in depression, the increase in anxiety, and the sense of alienation, the loss of purpose. So there's a whole range of psychological, emotional, and interpersonal side effects that come from chasing this certain life in the image of God. And I would argue that one of the reasons why the left went the route of diversity, equity, and inclusion was, in a sense, to replace the spiritual meaning that was lost in people's lives when they when you went into. So like I've mentioned too, and I don't mean to monopolize.
Why is it the case that the mass society leads to those things, though? So, for example, I'm currently writing a review of The Ancient City by Fuchtel de Calandre, however you pronounce it. His claim, it's a 19th century book, and it's basically his claim, which I have not really evaluated yet, and I'm not truly competent to evaluate, but is that ancient, meaning in this case Greek and Roman, social organization, political systems were wholly derived originally from ancestor worship, a very primitive form of religion, including such things as property law and marriage law, and so on and so forth. So that was very much the definition, not of a mass society. And so, and over time, these things change through what he calls, I think accurately, revolutions, to be things like you see the Roman Republic and ultimately the Roman Empire, and then all this kind of organization changed with the Christian era. But it's the mass society, meaning 19th century and onward, say industrialized, large-scale societies, does seem to lead to all sorts of bad things. But why is that necessarily the fault of the mass society? So, for example, if you're Carl Schmitt, you would say, you might not have opinions about the mass society, but you would say that all modern Western mass societies are incredibly defective politically because they engage in what he would call political romanticism. That is a lack of what he would call decisionism, where he called political romanticism the endless conversation, where nothing has any meaning because people just talk about it all day long. And so, for example, I mean, this is a very loaded question. I don't mean it more, but if you could ask Germans of the 1930s, would you say that they would have the same anomie and other problems of a 1960s or 1980s or 2020s America mass society? Probably not. I mean, different social organization, different political organization, but still a mass society. It's not clear that you can you can say every mass society leads to all these problems that we identify because they're our problems.
Yeah, although what is interesting is what initially compelled Ellul to write his book on propaganda was the experience of World War II. So apparently, in the 30s, he went to Germany just to kind of see what was the whole deal with this, Austrian painter guy, and found himself at one of these rallies and surprisingly compelled by the whole thing. Like he said, the pull of it was, he says, very, very hard to resist. And so there is a sense that, and so then this was what really began him on the journey to kind of understand sort of what happened to Germany in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, but did those people have malaise and depression and mental illness? Probably not. I mean, they had many other problems.
But it was
perhaps. But I mean, it
was the sense of when the plug was pulled afterwards. What happened to the Germans in a sense too? This is they just there was a decade or so where Germany was just kind of lost because they had to kind of figure out. And he says they basically had to be reprogrammed, almost like you get when you take somebody out of a cult. They almost had to be reprogrammed. And that's in a sense what you see today in modern Germany is kind of the result of that reprogramming.
Sure, they were reprogrammed. I mean, and that has its own set of, but I mean, my point is not whether 1930s Germany had any particular set of characteristics. My point is that we used to have the ancient city with ancestor worship. We're not going to go back to the ancient city with ancestor worship. And one of Fuchtel's claims is that you can't go back, and that's kind of obviously the case. There's man's understanding of his nature to the universe has changed we no longer think that our ancestors live in the holes in the ground and their spirits are directly influencing us. And it's essentially impossible to return to that kind of primitive conception of religion. But it's not clear why the mass society is bad, I guess. I mean, yes, in some kind of theoretical thing, the yeoman farmer might be better. It might not be, but Ellul's claim seems to be that the mass society is inherently bad and requires propaganda, which it seems to me to be a loaded term, inappropriate here, to be organized. Why is that true? I mean, people are still independent actors, and it basically denies agency to people to say that all the mass, it's like Gustave Le Bon and the madness of crowds. I'm making these out in another book. Whatever, like this idea that people don't have any agency because they're part of the mass, and that doesn't seem to me to be true.
I think the sense of that, it's the contrast between, what happens to you when you live in organic communities sort of built around, like the Dunbar number, right? You basically, your life is built around like 150, maybe 300, because you'd have like, say, 100 families, right? So adults, husband and wives together. So you'd have two overlaying groups of Dunbar. So you'd have 150 families, maybe a community of about, I've been in a church of 150 families, so about 700 or so people,
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the limit. And there you sort of reach the limits of, what you would call sort of an organic human community. Sure. And then, so the function, Ellul argues that the function is then to move beyond that. You have to begin to break down those normal organic communities, to break people out of them so you can reorganize them into the mass. Now, I think in terms of my argument, like technology is not going away. Like, unless people have this great amnesis, where they completely forget about technology, which it doesn't seem plausible, that some peace has to be made with the technological. And one of those pieces, I think, revolves around, or one aspect of making peace with technology involves around the scale of society. So can we say no to constantly scaling ourselves up, or will, the exigencies of, empire and scale, the things that you were talking about in that recent book on the Martian general, will we be basically forced to descale? And that's maybe the larger question. And so for me, I guess what I'm looking at in some of the things that I see in Trump are the very kinds of things that you see people like Marshall McLuhan and Jacques Ellul and, like Jos Meerloo, who wrote The Rape of the Mind, and some of the other. These are the types of things, the phenomenon that you see in terms of surrounding, what's the other guy? Bernays, in terms of propaganda, that everything's kind of being kept going with the constant messaging. But at a certain point in time, that's going to break down and sort of what's next, along with, and I think you're seeing some of that still today.
That's the crux of it. When you say everything is kept going, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I think there is the sense of, everybody, doing their part. Like my 18-year-old daughter has this, phrase like where she jokes about it. You're a good citizen, Dad. So right. And it's sort of her way of like, sort of mocking you for just, like, aren't we good citizens today? Or he's a good citizen. He waited for the light to turn to try, So she, as a young lady is beginning to see how the modern world and the messaging wants to shape us into a series of actions. And rather than those messages, and so I guess here's the thing, the difference in propaganda, those messages used to come organically on a horizontal from the people who lived around you. Nobody ever woke up on their own and said, well, this is how I should act. We were always shaped externally by the people around us and by community. And so they were kept more. So when you break apart communities, if you want to hold society together, you still need those same messages. And what Ellul argues with propaganda is those same messages are now coming vertically from the propaganda and not horizontally, organically from your neighbors like they would in an organic community. So in a sense, all the functions that would have been there in that organic community, horizontal, that kept everything humming along and working properly, everybody knowing the role and sort of the unspoken way of sort of, well, that's just kind of how we do things around here, son. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Now, all of that is done intentionally through mass media messaging. Across the board in all of its various formats, whether it's like news or whether it's, your television show or your product advertising or it's political advertisements. But even in a sense this way, the kinds of political actions that are being taken now by Trump and his team are again, they're sending a certain message about this is the way things should be. And so they've made a particular political argument for that. And so they're acting on that political argument that they've built, propagandistically with the people sort of in those vertical relationships. And now they've laid the messaging groundwork with the mass to sort of act on the political agenda that they have. So there's a sense of alignment there now.
As a descriptive matter, there's elements of truth there, in that certainly the modern world is much more of a mass society than the pre-modern world. I think, there's a lot being elided in this. For example, you and I still have church communities, and much of what we do day to day is based upon, has nothing whatsoever to do with messaging or propaganda, but is much more reliant on those other communities. And that's true, very true for some segments of society, and not at all true for others. If you're a single female who lives in the big city now, unmarried, your entire life is dominated by messaging, and both directly and through your dumbass social group that you're no doubt a part of, and who also receives the same messaging. That's why that kind of voter is the worst possible, because they are susceptible to this kind of propaganda. But again, what's not clear is that, and because we're focusing on Trump, is Trump's political messaging isn't meant to substitute for what your local community, and in general, right-wing political messaging is not meant to substitute for what your local community says. On a moral basis, it's at least in part intended to reinforce that. That is, to align with what traditionally these small local web of community relationships you have. It's meant to reinforce what those people are saying. You're assuming you're not in your local community is not a polycule, assuming it's a wholesome local community, and on a political basis, you're building political support for going to Mars or making it the Gulf of America or acquiring Greenland, just the kind of thing that political leaders do, and they use different technology because we have different technology, but it's not at all the same thing as mass messaging something like eat the bugs, live in the pod, these kind of things. These things are simply not comparable, even though it's true that they use the same mechanisms of communication, and it's true they're both addressed to a more massified society. It's not true that these things are the same.
Yes and no. Well, so here's the thing, though, right? And this is the point that Ellul makes, is that much of what used to be conveyed in terms of history, and I agree with you in a sense that and this is why the most prominent resistance, say, to the COVID regime came out of small, tight-knit church communities, because these are the people that are in many ways, even though they're not immune to the messaging, mass messaging. There is a certain degree of resistance to it, a certain degree of this tight-knit group allows you to have your own thoughts more than, like you say, the 20-something girl who lives in the urban city that's completely propagandized. But there is a sense where, and this was something, the specific example that Ellul used in the history of the United States with the first wave of mass immigration coming in the late 1800s, early 20th century, was that the question of how then do you unite all these people together as a single entity? And he argued that the choice that was made, whether it was made consciously or not, was to do it through propaganda. So there was that shift from America or Americas, the various localities, being a Virginian, a Texan, a Georgian, these types of ideas, to something of more of an abstracted whole. So you get the idea of, because the idea that you can have an organic community with 350 million across a continent-wide area is just sort of, it's almost silly on the face of it. But you can create a unified identity across that kind of space and mass using propaganda. So there is this sense where, and this is the case that Ellul makes, is
what
that
does propaganda mean in this context? Well, I mean, what's his definition?
Well, because again, it tells you, in a sense, it gives you an identity. So, and it says you are an American.
What is his definition of propaganda? I mean, is he merely saying messaging, or is he merely saying statements by political leaders, or what is propaganda?
Well, propaganda becomes, it's sort of the whole complex of everything you get from, and this is really why it becomes totalizing, right? So it's everything you get from schools to government actions to mass media communications, sort of what you might call anything that can be used to carry a narrative. You bring them all aligned and you create a kind of cohesive whole out of it, and then this shapes an identity that supersedes any sort of natural identity that might, group itself around a local organized community. And so this is the sense of where he argues that, a lot of what, people think of, where if you live in a mass market cult, like in a mass media culture, in a sense, your culture has become propaganda. You don't even realize it anymore, because your culture is basically, the propaganda is your culture. And so, I like in my last piece, he said, if everything is propaganda, is nothing propaganda. And there's a certain sense where maybe that is true, but there's also a sense where, and this is why I think it becomes, and Ellul makes his point, is that it has to be totalizing or not at all. So there is the sense that the messaging has to become, you either have to do this entirely over the whole society and be totalizing in that regard, or just, if you're doing it piecemeal, it doesn't really work and it's kind of bad messaging. Right. And so, and I think that's sort of, you want to get the whole society aligned together with the same purpose, all swimming in the same direction. So everybody is working on a certain conception of who they are as a nation. What is our main purpose? What are we doing here? Who are we all about? And then we just kind of set about doing it. And I think in many ways, the message that Trump is
an internally coherent description of modernity that fits the bill. Whether it's the only possible conception or of modernity is a different question. But if that's the claim, the answer is that in many ways it's obviously a miserable failure, because if what people aren't in America today is they're not all swimming in the same direction.
Well, they're not, and that's. Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem is that, and this was the thing, is that unfortunately towards the end of the Democrat progressive regime, is that part of the problem was that they became increasingly bad at propaganda. And so you noticed, because the propaganda was just so bad and ham-handed. And that's when people started waking, like COVID was maybe like the last straw for many people, but that was when people began to kind of pop their head up and go like, oh my word, all of this messaging is terrible. But that being said, then if people are looking at sort of like, what are the messages that resonate with me, and this is the thing that Ellul argues in propaganda, is that you're not really brainwashing people. You're using things that in some ways exist there already, but you're using them to create the kind of purposes that you want to create. So Trump and Musk have taken sort of basic foundational American ideas, and they've built a set of messages around that for a series of political goals that they have. The thing is that a majority of Americans are now aligned with those political goals, willingly. They've sort of given themselves over to it. And I guess we'll see, but my long-term thing is,
fiction, right? So I don't watch the Super Bowl, as I said, but
I watched 30 minutes of it.
I'll watch Super Bowl ads, and then people are talking about this silly NFL ad where this black girl boss shows a whole team of big white football players how much better she is than them. So this is a form of propaganda. which, to your earlier point, some people absorb and say, yeah, you go, girl, other people won't. But it's clearly something that objectively defies reality, but is instead designed to pander to a subsection of the population in order to encourage them in certain ideological beliefs in order to gain political ends. Okay, fine.
Exactly.
But what is the equivalent example, if any, for Musk's and Trump's political messaging? I mean, you say you're building this political messaging. Demonstrating my rocket can go up and come down and be caught is not at all the same thing. It's simply, it is in a sense, that is, you're using broadcast medium to show a success, hoping that success will resonate with people and have them support your political program, because everyone likes a winner and nothing succeeds like success. But to most people, that's not propaganda at all in the same sense as it is as the NFL ad is. Rather, I mean, if people want to look at that and say, you loser, I could do that better. I mean, okay, I guess maybe, that's a really legitimate reaction. That's like saying, I'm the Sun King Ra, and I'm going to fly to the moon. The reality is that when you show people that you're a winner, that's a form of propaganda, I suppose, but not at all in the same way.
No, and I think the core message is this, if you boil it down, is, well, again, it's make America great again, right? So it's a very simple message. The fundamental premise is that America has gotten off track, right? So America has great promise. It has a bright future. We are engaged in economic and technological progress. And if you look around, again, like this ad that we were just talking about, this NFL ad, which I did actually happen to see on Twitter today, because of all of this woke stuff that's going on, all of this progressive left stuff going on, America has gotten off track. And so we've gotten ourselves involved in needless wars. We're spending money, on all of these aid projects that just line the pockets of progressives. We've gotten on and on and on again. We've got all these extra governmental departments. So we're going to make America great again. We're going to go in. We're going to cut the fat. We're going to make America, efficient, productive. We're going to lean everything up, and we're going to. And then the positive image, that we're going to send people to Mars, right? So we're going to align that. And so now you've got an aligned messaging, which I do think basically aligns far better than the recent the progressive left. This aligns much more, I think, fundamentally with core American culture beliefs, with this sort of belief, the fundamental belief in human progress, right? So I think this aligns much more fundamentally with where a majority of Americans feel they're at. Now, this idea has, over a long time has been built. Again, it's a series of messaging, but I think the Trump messaging and their propaganda is probably better better messaging, better propaganda, because it aligns more fully with basically the core wiring of the system itself. Like, it's, in a sense, it doesn't seem like it's doing anything ideological, because it's aligned with the fundamental idea of the system itself, of the technological society as instantiated in America.
But then, is it doing something ideological? So let's imagine that the United States was currently constituted as it is now. That is 350 million people in a single nation, leaving aside that a bunch of those people should be kicked out. But that for all of those people, 80% of their meaning, or the way they viewed the world, or the things they thought they should do and should not do, was decided by their local community, their church community, their extended family. The way they thought about the world was not focused except maybe 20% on what people outside of their immediate circle and community thought. So in other words, this is obviously imaginary, but you have a society like America was before it lost its bowling leagues and so on, when it was like 120 million people in, say, the 1920s, where but 3 times as large now, with obviously much less homogeneity, but a society where the average person daily life is guided by local imperatives and dictates, rather than some kind of national messaged imperatives and dictates. So let's say we lived in that society, and let's say Trump and Musk want to push all those exact same things that you're saying there. Those would be very successful because that's what the people want. That is, if they're part of this nation, the fact is that people don't want in America and have not wanted for a long time to be only part of their local community and not part of something larger. And it's a false dichotomy to say that the mass society is unimportant to people who are dominated by their community. I would imagine that in that scenario, the messaging that Trump and Musk are pushing out would be just as popular as it is now, which suggests it's not some kind of manipulation.
Well,
and that's kind of my fundamental objection, which is to talk about propaganda and communication. The mass society tends to elide the fact that some of such things are manipulations and others are merely political action. And those things are not the same thing.
There is a sense where, I mean, like you say, the ideas that, and we're the technological society is really, this is kind of, again, analyzing sort of what happened in the 20th century and in this regard. And so, as you say, you get into the 1900s and so forth, that a significant amount of what happened was organic and built around. But there was also then a specific cultural milieu and a certain set of ideas that were embedded within the people, and they kind of grew organically, spread organically, and a significant amount were carried, like the idea of manifest destiny, the expansion of the West. All of these ideas were things that a certain group of people that impelled them to, cross the ocean, set up colonies, expand across North America. There was a set of ideas that these people carried, and these were real, they were organic. And at some point, decision was made, whatever, there was a sense of, okay, how do we take this to the next level? And the next level involved then, breaking down those same communities and taking the implicit ideas that were held organically and then, abstracting them, rationalizing them, and turning them into mass messaging. And that's the fundamental argument that Ellul makes. He says, you're not starting from scratch, because if you start from scratch, you can't do it. You have to basically work with what's there, and you have to be in line with the basic sentiments that are in some ways there in the people, but you use those sentiments to then manipulate them towards the ends you want. And the ends you want are fundamentally building this larger technology, in a sense, to justify why we're doing the things we're doing on the local level, to build and accumulate political power and wealth at scale across the society. So there's and when exactly this transition happened, you could point to it partially in the first wave of mass immigration in the U.S., which I think is a good, demarking line. So again, that would explain, like, okay, why do you suddenly need to use messaging? Well, because you brought in a whole people that were not culturally aligned with the founding stock. And so you had to get them on board quickly. And well, how do you get them boarded quickly? You do it with messaging. And this is the thing, he says, in some sense, as society scales up, you need this messaging, because the old ways of doing things are too slow to react to the pace of the increased pace of technological society. So what used to be natural and natural substrate begins to be abstracted, rationalized, and then fed back to people through these manipulative messages. So they're taking the things that are there within them and then using them against them to create certain, social and political ends. And that's the basic thesis of it.
That strikes me as both internally coherent and a factually accurate description of 20th century America, not of much else beyond America and not beyond the 20th century. But
it was true sort of in Europe, and that was like for World War II in Europe and so forth too as well. Britain, So, anyways, yes, but probably the most places most true is in America. Is in America.
But it also strikes me as entirely possible this is falls perilously close to being a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. That is, I describe what has happened, therefore it must have happened. Must have happened that way. And moreover, we keep sliding back and forth between manipulative messaging and implicitly non-manipulative messaging. and we're not making a clear distinction between those two. So, for
maybe
example,
that's the fundamental point of this debate: is what Trump and Musk are doing, is it manipulative or
I think
non-manipulative?
it probably is. I mean, we can talk in the abstract, like what if America were a different society all day long, but it isn't. But so on the 20th century immigration, obviously there was extremely manipulative messaging, both manipulation of the immigrants in order to get them back when they use the melting pot rather than the tossed salad or whatever it is as the metaphor, and then of course even more manipulative messaging of the heritage Americans with things like that filthy, nasty Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty, saying it's our job to get trash from all over the world, and things like that. So I mean, the original tweet that we were talking about was, I think, around this question too, which is that is the current messaging being put out over the past, say, 3 weeks or maybe a couple more weeks by the Trump administration and its allies, a manipulative set of messaging or not? And manipulative obviously carry different things. I mean, everything is manipulative at some level, right? People say things because they want other people to do things. Hey, baby, you look beautiful tonight. I mean, don't get me wrong, my wife always looks beautiful, but and I would maintain that the answer is no in any meaningful sense. That is, the Trump, whatever his faults may be, and the same thing is true for Musk, but there's different faults, has a vision of America that is meant to be good for all Americans and is based in reality. And their messaging goes around, how can we implement policies that make things better for all Americans? I mean, that's does not strike me as a fundamentally manipulative type of messaging.
Well, and then I would just basically, and then everybody comes from a certain point, and I would say, well, it because it's mass media communications, it can't avoid but being manipulative. And so, again, it comes back to probably one of these things that,
I'm positing that everything is manipulative at some level. But what I mean is colloquially manipulative, where people say, where the average person would say, this messaging is an attempt to manipulate me into believing something and doing something that I would not otherwise do.
Yeah.
So, for example, into believing that dumbass things like trans men are men, like a classic example, like the old thing about the Chinese emperor who made his courtiers say that a horse was a deer in order to identify the ones who are not compliant. I mean, that is a manipulative form of messaging that's designed to basically destroy people's core beliefs, as well as identify and allow the extermination of people who are non-compliant. I mean, that's just a fundamentally different thing than saying, let's all go to Mars and improve the government.
Yes, but at the same time, though, there is the sense of like, okay, what is the very best tools that we have in order to do this, right? Well, we need to employ these very sophisticated algorithms and apply them through all of them. So we're going to use, for lack of a better term,
we employ big balls. Big balls. He's who we're employing.
But then you could see down the way to where, as we tackle the immigration problem, which everybody wants, because people want that tackled, where the immigration problem is used manipulatively as the step for, digital tracking, digital currency, and digital IDs. So there's a sense of like, okay, where is it going, and the degree of manipulation. And the question, I guess, lies is to what degree is the fundamental substrate? Is this really what people would want if they were left to their own devices outside of a mass society, or is this something that has been stirred within them through the messaging that's amenable to something that was there to begin with? So in a sense, there's a fundamental urge that's been used for a number of years to, in a sense, to make America great. We have to be a global empire astride the globe. So how much do people on the ground, if left to their own devices, feel a burning urge to create an empire? And maybe that's an open question. The empire is a bad example because the most of what
we're conflating a bunch of things here. I mean, for example, you could argue that all this messaging is because Musk is the Antichrist. And any moment now, he's going to rip off his skin and reveal that he's the Antichrist. And therefore, this is manipulative messaging, because he's going to say, here is your digital ID and digital currency. But there's no evidence for that, right? I mean, that's not an argument for saying the messaging.
Line up for your 666 on your forehead.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like, and so and same thing is true for empire. It is true that there's a certain amount of messaging, and has been for 100 years, about America as empire. It is not at all clear that that messaging is something that is any core part of Trump's messaging, and much evidence to the contrary. That yes, he wants to influence if anything, an objective observer would say Trump seems to want to get back to kind of the Monroe Doctrine, rather than, and let the Europeans deal with the Europeans, and settle there's dumbass fights that we get into, and don't fund condoms in Gaza. I mean, so there's no evidence whatsoever that, just thinking about it, that the messaging is focused on empire. In fact, if anything, again, it's focused on what's good for the American people, with the premise that, with no premise in there that empire is what's good for the American people. That was George W. Bush. God rot him.
Yeah. Okay. But now here's another fundamental, I guess, dispute. So this is one of these arguments in terms of messaging, and it's a subtle difference. Is make America great again the same thing as make Americans great again? And this came up in sort of, and I know Vivek got completely, like, basically he was done after that, but the whole H-1B thing with Musk. And so there's these one of these things, is a sense of, like, what is actually meant by make America great again? Are we making an abstract idea of America great again, or are we making Americans great again? And I'm looking at this from the outside as a Canadian. And so it's one of these things, for, again, as an open question. And I'm not necessarily convinced. And maybe a lot of this is just a certain skepticism. But for me, I think to myself that, that while, ripping up the patronage network of the left is a good thing, I'm not 100% convinced that, I don't know. I'm not 100% convinced that what Trump and Musk are trying to pull off is actually achievable. In the sense of, we need to get back to the basics of, the sort of the core, stripped down, fundamental technological system of, and this was, I sense, that Andreessen tweet, where we got to get back to making great products again. Well, for a lot of people who have BS jobs, now maybe none of these people will be put out of work, they're not making great products. So where do they find meaning in life? Well, one of the things that gave them meaning in life was the whole DEI regimen. So yeah, your job was BS, but you had this fundamental belief that you were working for the greater good in creating an equitable society, or whatever other do-gooder thing that you were doing across, the network. So the question that I have is once all of this garbage is stripped away, what will give people meaning again? And will the messaging that Trump and Musk and so forth that they're putting together, will they be able to provide for people the kind of if, assuming that we're still in a mass society and most of people's direction is coming to them horizontally from, the mass media outlets. So what is the messaging that then will give them the meaning that they were craving, that meaning thing was filled with DEI? Because I think there's still an underlying gap there that I'm not quite sure that Trump and Musk have quite worked that out for the long term.
That's definitely true. I mean, the snarky answer is that they'll give them meaning by giving them a pickaxe and telling them to mine inside an asteroid. But
the children thirst for the mines, right? Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen the TV series based on a book, The Expanse, which gives a reasonable view of space mining, and it's not necessarily pleasant. But that is not a question. That's really a question that's orthogonal to all these other questions. How does one restore meaning to? And the short answer, of course, is religion.
That's right. And real.
the only way you actually get the asteroid mining in Mars is if you have a type of great awakening, and you have people in the entire society pulling in harness, and you take a bunch of other extremely aggressive actions. That is, you end the American empire, you expel people from America who do not fit with America, who have been admitted here since 1965. There's a whole bunch of things you have to do in order to make America great again. Make America great again, you're completely right, as a messaging thing right now, is all just feels. And the reason there's no distinction between make America great again and make Americans great again is that nobody wants to parse that distinction, because that would involve unpleasant questions. And why would you do that? It's all about the feels. So I think that,
well, and that was, I guess, my point is it feels like we're all about the vibes. And so if we're all about the vibes, that's fundamentally propaganda at work. And that's, I guess, where I was coming at it.
But yes. And at some level it's manipulative to push out, to push out vibes, but every human relationship is based upon that. I say X, hoping that it will produce effect Z on person Y. I mean, that's true when, Ugg and Bug sat in the cave looking at the fire, and Ugg wanted Bug to go get the wood. I mean, that's just the way it goes. I mean, everything's manipulative in some kind of extremely high level of generality. So I think that just because they're pushing the feels doesn't mean it's some kind of manipulative propaganda in the colloquial sense that people think of that. It's a mechanism of attempting to create political action and consensus, which of course is what propaganda is at some level. But again, the colloquial definition of propaganda, as it's been imposed on us in the past 20 years in particular, is really different from that.
Yeah. Now, again, and this is maybe, the sort of dovetails into one of these other questions, in a sense, can you make Americans great again and keep America in that sense? Because, it comes back to the whole question of scale and community. Because as you were talking about in terms of manipulative relationships, and this is one of the things that Schmidt talks about in terms of the political, is that the real political is based upon almost in a sense of, that shared sense of identity. And there's a shared collective sense of like, we live in a sinful world. So there's no way that you're free from, entirely from manipulation, but there's a sense that when you're in a family bond, in a family group, there's a certain things that you do. I mean, yeah, kids try to manipulate their parents, but there's a sense of like, we have transcended the ways that we manipulate each other to have a collective, identity as a family, as a community, as a political entity. And this unified society that we have, we are all basically working towards the same ends. So we're not trying to gain something else on each other, but we're trying to work together for our own existential future and survival in that regard. And,
sure,
and so I think,
Schmidt. But
yeah, that's right. And so I think
that fits perfectly into what Trump is doing, doesn't it?
Well, but in some sense, though, to really instantiate that, you almost have to break society back up into those smaller units that can do that organically. Right? So that's,
there, Schmidt would completely disagree with you. I mean, Schmidt would say that very large polities are perfectly capable of seeing who the people are that threaten their way of life. And it depends obviously on how you define the American way of life. If you define it as like there's a term for, if I'm a primitive Baptist, and everyone who's not a primitive Baptist is not American. Okay, fine then, I guess. But if the American way of life is optimism, expansionism, ordered freedom, all the things that would be recognizable to Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson, how is what Trump is selling any different?
Well, the question is that the same thing? Is Trump selling the same thing, or is he selling a series of messages that are a kind of a simulacrum that, play on the living reality that was there in the 1700s? And that's more or less what I would argue.
Okay, but we're back to Musk being the Antichrist. I mean, yeah, maybe.
Well, not quite really, but yeah, but in the sense of.
Yes, I mean that's necessarily true because we live in end stage empire, and you wrote on you were writing about Joseph Tainter and the collapse of complex societies. and like I'm always, talking to Malcolm Shiuni about this, who I'm a big fan of Malcolm Shiuni, and no one else is on the dissident right anymore, except for maybe the good old boys. But the fact is that history is not with us in terms of late stage empires.
No.
But I'm here for the feels. And so,
yeah, whereas I still like, I still try to remain true. The collapsed hards have kind of gone away for a while. But I'm still, I miss the old collapsed hard dialogues and some of the guys that have kind of come and gone. But there is that sense that, and as you were saying in the Martian general, that he, this idea that, once this is all over, it probably really is over. And, so, and I guess the question of like, can we keep our life and lose it too? I don't know. And so what happens when we actually descale? And, if Trump succeeds in scaling back the imperial pretensions and focusing just on America again, it'll probably allow, because, there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system now, there probably will be a boost. But what happens when those inefficiencies have been eaten up? I don't know. Is it sustainable over the long term? Who knows? Not. I mean, we'll see.
This is a different topic, but it totally.
But yeah.
But like more than half the federal budget is a direct transfer payment of cash, either directly or indirectly to providers for old people. That's simply not sustainable. What you should do is you cut off those payments and then deny the vote to old people. That'll solve the problem. But that would be dramatic. I mean, I'm all dramatic. I think, and certainly old people without children should absolutely never be allowed to have any political influence whatsoever. Because all they do is take from the young, because they're, and in the fact that they have no children, no doubt causes them enormous resentment. And so, old people with no children should be like politically sidelined to the max degree. But probably all the other old people should be too. But that's a different story.
Eusebius has written on this in terms of how it's destroyed German politics.
Doesn't surprise me. So, I just thought of that now, but I think that, of all the people who should be stripped of the right to vote, certainly, anyone under 21 should be stripped of the right to vote, and anyone, who's dependent on the government.
Yeah, we're going to clip this and use it to promote this video. Yeah.
That'd be fine. But anyone over 65 who has no children, or had no children, like people whose children have died, I think, probably should not be punished. But anyone who chose not to have or was unable to have children in 6-7 over has no stake in the future, and therefore, or not a direct stake in the future, even if they have collateral descendants, and therefore should be denied the right to have any political influence whatsoever.
Well, and I don't necessarily disagree. But before, I don't want to keep you too much longer. John. But there was one thing that you said recently, and I forget which book review it was in, but where you were talking about sort of, a modest reassessment of the techno-optimist, the techno-optimist position, and sort of being somewhat more realistic about that. But yet at the same time saying that in some ways, Musk has no choice but to go to Mars, even though the outlook over the long term is not optimistic, because societies need to go to Mars or really bad things are happening.
I'm not sure I said anything specific. Exactly. Some of those sound like things I've said, but none of them sound precisely like what I've said. No. My points about Musk are what drives Musk. That is, he doesn't have to go to Mars. His reasons are what his reasons are, but those reasons necessarily led to him turning against the regime. And the techno-optimism thing is something that I go back and forth on. Like, I'm a techno-optimist, but I'm perfectly well aware of the downsides of technology, many of which relate to some of the things that we've been talking about today. That is, it's very corrosive of the unchosen bond society technology is, and there's any number of other problems with it. But you said this as well. Technology isn't going away, so we have to deal with that.
Yeah, you have to come to grips with it. Yeah, and also the question of, and I still go back and forth on this, is, Tolkien's argument that, the Shire is the best we can do, the sort of stasis. And while part of me thinks that, yes, ideally that would be good, that in the life that history shows us that all societies have kind of a lifestyle. They're born, they go through a youthful period, then they're mature, and then they die. And part of the youthful period is that they're expansive. And, is there a way to sidestep that? And I'm not necessarily sure that there is, just as I think his thesis of the ring, which is a substitute for the power of technology, you basically have to get rid of it. Well, in an ideal world, yeah, sure. In your story, you can throw the ring into Mount Doom and it melts and then it's gone. But in the real world, we remember how to build machines. And so as long as somebody remembers how to build machines, they're going to think, with all these other people that aren't building machines, if I build machines, I can dominate them all and make myself powerful and wealthy. And so, the problem is just going to be with us for as long, unless people somehow magically manage to forget about machines. The problem of dealing with technology is going to stay with us. This question of stasis versus expansion is going to remain with us as well.
I mean, the Shire is not a real place. I'm listening to, I'm reading Christopher Lash's The True and Only Heaven from 1991, which is... Oh, yeah,
that's a good one, actually.
It's very good so far. But he makes the point, he's talking about nostalgia and pastoralism, that is the romantic 19th century idea of pastoralism. Pastoralism isn't an actual place. Because I've spent quite a bit of time among peasant societies in Eastern Europe, and let me tell you, they're a bunch of scumbags. The fact is that peasants, not all of them, but there's a reason that the rural proletariat is not that dissimilar to the urban proletariat. They're the proletariat for a reason. And this idea that somehow peasants are somehow more virtuous crops up in all sorts of societies. Like my mother has this, who's Hungarian, was born in Hungary, has this delusional idea that the Transylvanian peasantry are the core of the Hungarian identity. No, they're a bunch of chiselers. And drunks. I've been there. I know. I was there. Yes, there's some good people and so on, but like every other place, there's good people and there's bad people, and they're all just trying to get by. There's not some kind of magic to being a peasant. Being a peasant sucks. And so the Shire sucks too. The Shire, we have this, the fact is the Shire in real life, now there may have been English villages that were pretty nice and so on, but what English villages had that made them nice, that isn't in the Shire? A lord. That is, so anyway, I'm getting way off topic here.
No, it's fine.
But your general point is I agree with, certainly.
Yeah, no, that's good. And we've been going at this now for an hour, Charles, and I should probably let you get on with your day, but I really appreciate you coming out. It's a good conversation. It's nice to actually have a back and forth, because I find sometimes if we're too agreeable, you don't have to think hard. And if absolutely. Somebody pushes back, and you have to push back on the fly, it makes you think about the things that you're thinking. And this for me is good, because it's given me some stuff to think about and to mull over. So
awesome. Have a great day.
You too, Charles. Take care.
Bye.
Seeking the Hidden Thing is delighted to have Axios Fitness Coaching as a sponsorship partner. JD is one of our guys and wants to make you fit for what's coming ahead. He offers a premium resource for holistic strength and conditioning. Axios offers standalone training programs as well as individual coaching options should your needs require something more specific. Click on either the image below or the link in the description. Both I and JD thank you for your support.